So, the lecture I put together, and the story that I'm about to tell, is really a story about the evolution of disability rights and norms. But not quite the rights yet, because as you saw in the first lecture, those rights are relatively new. There really were no codified rights until those guys took over the federal building and decided to claim those rights, right? So what we're going to talk about is a story about how cities had positioned people with disabilities. How cities, mostly through the US, had conceptualized the role of the disabled citizen, right? And how over various eras in the field of urban planning, eras, or specifically, I'll get into 4 eras over the last 100 years, how those 4 eras embed conceptions of disability that play out in the built environment. An idea that is made manifest in the physical form. So, key concepts. People with disabilities as a concept is not really defined in the era that I'll be talking about. Understanding disability evolved, and there really is an approach to treatment. I want to go through this relatively quickly. So very quickly, and you guys can dive into this more. This image on the screen shows a Spartan warrior pushing his disabled colleague off the side of a cliff and saying, "I will kill you to stop you from suffering." Tragically comical, because under this historical, very traditional ancient model of disability, it's really the willingness of God. It's a test of God. There's all these weird mystical ways the disability was conceived as a divine punishment, part of sin. It was believed that it was easier to eliminate people whose lives would be difficult. This is a caricature. I'm going to show you 3 quick caricatures before I start the actual lecture, just to sort of give you guys some tools to work with as we go into the examples from the city, right? The charity model is a different model of disability, and that's really saying that I, pobrecito, my poor little child, or poor, person that can't do anything for themselves, your inferior, your useless dependent status really requires me to feel sorry for you and to give you something, because I'm in a position of ability, you're in a position of disability, so let me bestow my charity upon you. The medical model, also called the biological model of disability, really says that the problem belongs to the individual, it resides in the individual, and the individual must be fixed in order to fit into society. So the medical model basically has a caricature here on the screen that shows a doctor, some nurses, and a young man in a wheelchair by some stairs, and the doctor's patting the person on the back, and he says, "We will rehabilitate you so that you can overcome all barriers. We will fix you so that you fit in the environment." The disability model, or the social inclusion model, which is really where the struggle that you saw play out, is basically saying, we need to get organized, we need to get stronger, we need to reshape the way that society thinks about us, and we need to be able to rechange the way society builds their cities. Next slide. So those are sort of the ways, 3 concepts, in a very quick way, and we'll come back to these models of disability over time. But how these concepts then sort of manifest the kinds of spaces that we build. these concepts are embedded in the streets we design, the buildings we design, schools we design, everything we design. These concepts are embedded. Does everybody understand that so far? Good. Okay. The environmental design basically is about this process of understanding the environment, how you devise plans, programs, policies, how you think about the measurement of the space, the characteristics of the space. Urban planning is technical political process concerned with the development of land, protection of use of the environment, public welfare, design of space. Again, both of these issues now that we're going to talk about embed concepts of disability, either implicitly or explicitly. Now the lecture starts. So the models, again, I'm going to come back to that over the course of the class, but those are like short, kind of quick ways of thinking about the way society positions disability. All right, so we're going to go very quickly into a century of city planning and try to locate the sociocultural and economic perspective or positioning of disability. The first part of the lecture talks about the industrial nation state from 1860 to about 1918 to World War I, modernity, markets, welfare state, up to 1940, age of normalization, in which the medical model became very ingrained and defined, and then the independence and rights movement, which was, as you saw in the video, since the 70s. Again, every era carries with it unexplored implications and unexplored knowledge about the social perceptions of difference, the social perceptions of vulnerability, the social perceptions of human condition. And those perceptions are embedded in the things we build. We can apply a disability lens to the design work and to history as well, and really try to map out how the concepts that we've had over time are still with us today. So the model I talked about earlier, which is the medical model of disability, really had an essentialist definition. Essentialist, meaning that was your essence. Disability was your functional limitation. And your functional limitation, or your disease, or your impairment, or the thing that made you broken, is what is your situation. So the defining characteristic of your entire life becomes your disability, because you are basically not a man, you're not a teacher, you're not a father, you don't have any other identity besides being a disabled person. So I want you to think about what that means. When society rips away all your other identities to sort of take the shortcut and say you're just disabled, right? So we'll come back to that. So we're going to analyze how urban life looked for people with disabilities, how people interacted, and how different populations engaged with their city. Next slide. In the beginning of these eras, right, people mostly lived on farms. People lived in a very rural kind of environment. And in this rural environment, there were collectivist, pre-industrial America. People lived on a farm. There were extended families that worked together, and everybody had a role. And one of the critiques is that urbanization, the growth of cities, actually meant that people that had intellectual disabilities, that used to be able to work on the farm, or people with other kinds of disabilities, that were able to do something, whether it was some chore, some task. There was always a role for a person with a disability in this sort of extended network, in this sort of agricultural kind of economy, right? But as cities grew, citizens, the kind of life people had started to change. Meaning that as cities grew and industries developed, people needed to become functional to work in a factory. People sort of had different types of ways that they could fit into that society. And urban life separated home from work. Division of labor changed, social organization, and industrialization perpetuated disablement. So as these cities grew and industries grew, a lot of people started to engage in this production of these industries, and a lot of accidents happened. And a lot of other kinds of disabilities developed through industrial accidents. So there's this transformation that's occurring that sort of changes the way disability is understood in this era. Next slide. There's also simultaneously to that development of this idea of culture and care. Charitable social programs start to develop in cities to protect people with disabilities. Because to the most part, these cities in turn of the century America, people were abandoned to their destiny. These were really ruthless places with tenements, with massive public health issues. Cities were growing so fast, and there really wasn't such a thing as city planning as these cities were developing. So scarcity and opulence perpetuated the notion of human inferiority and human superiority. Now, planning starts to develop in sort of this turn of the century time with new ideas such as sewer and sanitary reforms, also tenement reforms and immigration laws. Tenement reforms were these very, very highly dense, low-income housing units where people live in squalor, just to be able to live in a city and have a job and things like that. And they needed to be reformed, and there needed to be sort of laws that start to impact the way people can organize and live in these cities. There is also ideas that start to develop on immigration, the exclusion from this country of the morally, mentally, and physically deficient is the principal objective to be accomplished by the immigration laws of the United States. So, concept of defectiveness, of morally and mental disability as being something highly, highly unwanted, started to perpetuate itself into laws. And this idea of crippled boys' homes or cottages for crippled girls developed. A lot of children were being abandoned also into orphanages at the time by parents that weren't able to care for their children in the cities. And again, these cities were, to a most part, very dense, very dirty, very loud, and very poor. And a lot of immigration is also happening in the East Coast, cities like New York and such. So I'm going to present here an image of a very famous photographer, Reese, that published a very powerful series of articles called How the Other Half Lives. And here you have an example of these tenement homes where there's open sewer on the street, several generations and several families living in one bedroom, and just really very, very challenging conditions in the New York tenements. So disability and poverty prevailed because as people lived in poverty, there was a higher incidence of acquiring and developing disabilities. And as people became more disabled, the family members could not work, and they slipped further and further into poverty and despair. And so there was a social response to that with the charities and so on and so forth. So there's also this idea that these charities that are developing really are developing because there is no public policy that really supports social welfare. So there's a set of concepts that develop within a city social movement, which is that the city actually can't be so incredibly cruel and inhumane. There has to be a social dimension to the way our cities grow and in which they're governed. So there was in 1906, 1909, the Committee on the Congestion of Populations. And that became the first national conference on city planning in 1909. So that is the event when city planning actually starts to become more codified. But what's interesting from a disability perspective is that the whole profession of city planning basically starts as a response to a public welfare challenge, public health challenge. So disability and disease and the burden of disease becomes one of the main impetus for starting to regulate and starting to design more policies in cities. So these ideas of how to make cities and these dirty cities with all this congestion and pollution, how to make them more livable, starts to coalesce in a concept called the Garden City. Has anybody heard of the Garden City? Do you know anything about it? Okay, go ahead.
I could have sworn it was something. I think I was getting confused with like Radiant City, but
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. So the Garden City is Howard, Ebenezer Howard, a British guy that came to the United States. Some of the research that I did shows that he suffered from asthma. And so he left the UK, Manchester, I think, because there was so much pollution, you couldn't even see the sun come out. That's how much pollution there was. And he came to Nebraska, and he saw these open fields, and he saw this American and turn of the century America. And he started to develop concepts of what a clean city would look like. And in a sense, his concept became the foundations of the profession. So he came up with this concept called the Garden City. But what's super interesting is that you can find within his concept of what a city should look like a couple unique features. Can somebody tell me what kind of unique features they could be? And let me describe this for folks that can't see it. There are a set of concentric circles that are interconnected by radial and diagonal lines, and these sort of start to create ways that the city can function, with a central city in the middle, with a population of 58,000 people, and larger kind of nodes of peripheral cities around this central city. So he calls this a group of slumless, smokeless cities. A group that has a total area of 66,000 acres and a population of 250,000 people. So this image is kind of a sketch of how Ebenezer Howard wanted to think about organizing and making a city more legible. But it's really interesting that he also included into the city an insane asylum. He included into the city home for inebriates. He included home for the waifs. He included an epileptic farm. He included a convalescent home, as well as reservoirs, as well as transportation structures, as well as cemeteries, as well as schools, industrial homes. So he embeds clearly spaces within his garden city for disability. And he defines these spaces as humane, as clean, a place where people can have a good quality of life, as opposed to the city where they would be subject to great hardships. Any comments on what I just said? Yes.
So is he saying, like, is he in a sense segregating it, or is it like a part of it? I'm not really understanding like the whole drawing itself, but like, so is this like the insane asylum outside of the central city, like not a part of it?
So correct. He's conceptualizing this as a separate spaces.
Okay.
The reason why he's creating separate spaces is because everything was so mashed up and so chaotic and so filthy and dirty and crazy in these tenement homes that there was no real way to even deliver services in these sort of congested cities. Yes. Howard's a huge figure in the field of urban planning, and you can't get a master's degree in urban planning without studying Howard. But nobody from my profession has talked and pointed out to the disability dimension of his work. Any other questions on this? Owen? Or Gordon? Any idea?
Interesting design. I don't know how effective it would be as populations begin to move about.
Yeah. So again, this is an effort to create a legible city, and this was tried a couple times in the UK and a couple places in the US, but overall, cities would not conform to something as neat as this, right? So again, you are embedding disability as you're spatializing disability within this beautiful concept of this garden city, these clean cities. But there's other pressures, and in the 1893 World Fair in Chicago really gave birth to this idea called City Beautiful. And the City Beautiful movement really was about this resurgence of pride in an aesthetic that sought to eliminate any notion of deviance, any notion of grotesque ugliness, whether it was in buildings or in human beings. So there's a movement of architects and planners and civic leaders in this idea of City Beautiful that wanted beauty to eliminate any notion of corruption, or any notion of decadence, or any notion of deformity. And so the concept of the City Beautiful proponents was, if we make our city beautiful, people will behave better. If we make our city beautiful, people will have higher morals. If we make our city beautiful, there will be no disability. There will be no poverty. It's kind of like whitewashing the city and sweeping all the undesirable aspects kind of under the rug. And that's actually what's starting to happen. But you can see this is Daniel Berman's plan for Washington, D.C. No, Chicago. Daniel Berman's plan for Chicago. So he was a really important urban planner, early urban planner, an architect, and again, trying to create movement in cities, large avenues. Yes.
What's his name again?
Daniel Burnham. So if you're interested in this type of idea, you can also see this play out in Paris with the Champs-Élysées. You can see this sort of idea of these large avenues. It was an opportunity to sort of get all that crazy congestion out of cities and open up the city so that it can be governed. Because the challenge with the cities are so compact and so growing without any regulations. There was difficulty to govern those cities. Now, where does disability fit within the city beautiful? It's basically viewed as social blight. Just like a building can decay, can become ugly and dirty and fall apart, at the time people felt society could decay and become dirty and become, and fall apart. So disability, under this concept, was seen as social decay. And it was actually a huge threat because they felt that if you would see people, with poverty or living in squalor conditions, that the social order would continue to fall apart. And there was a huge conceptual confluence of naming mental, physical, and moral defective. So if you had a physical defect, you were also assumed to have an intellectual and a moral defect. If you had a intellectual defect, you were perceived to have a physical and moral defects. So I'm trying to say is there was an increasing concept of disability as being dangerous. Can you go back a little bit? And not only dangerous, but it's an embarrassing exposure of what the society is that you're trying to build. Planners actively helped place all deformities, including human differences, out of sight. And a great example of that is the Chicago Ugly Laws. Great reading on this topic if you're interested in it. We didn't assign it, but I think this is a really critical topic that you guys should look into, the Ugly Laws. So from the late 1860s until the 1970s, several American cities had ugly laws that deemed it illegal for persons who were unsightly or unseemly to appear in public. You could not show your face in public. Some of these laws were called also the beggar ordinances. And so the idea there was that if somebody thought that you looked ugly, you could be fined by the police for showing your face outside. The core idea there was that no less than 50 cents and no more than $50 or something like that. Some of the ordinances read. And so the idea was that, if you are seen disagreeable to people on the street, if you were an offense to a business, if you were understood to look like you were maimed, mutilated, or otherwise deformed, you really had no space in the city. You had no reason to be outside of the city. Otherwise, you would be threatened with having to pay a penalty, a fine. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but isn't that that just does, it's, everyone has their own perspective. I mean, they can't, and the whole culture and stuff that's on it is just.
Well, everybody had that perspective at that time. Which is why the cities passed these ordinances. I mean, I agree with you, but this actually happened. And the first city that passed this was in 1967, and guess which city it was? San Francisco. And the last city to actually arrest somebody and issue a penalty was, I think, in 1973 in Nebraska. Somebody actually was arrested in 1973 in Nebraska for being unsightly. And a disability rights leader in the 70s went with his friend to a restaurant, and the friend had cerebral palsy and oftentimes would drool while he ate. And the restaurant owner said, "Excuse me, sir, we refuse the right not to serve you in this restaurant." And he said, "What are you going to do, arrest us?" And when the police officer came, they charged them under this ugly law, and they removed them from the restaurant. Yeah.
But the disability rights movement kind of went hand in hand and gained a lot of steam from the civil rights movement. So how did these laws persist into the 1970s?
They were repealed. They were repealed one by one. And the last law, I said, was repealed in the 70s. But again, it shows you how disability was embedded and codified by public attitudes and opinions and beliefs and norms into laws. That's what this lecture is about. So let's move on from this. So you've got also this concept of modernity that starts to develop. So I talked a little bit about how crazy, dirty, congestion these cities were. I talked a little bit about the beautiful movement, all these ways to make cities more legible, right? To have more ways of controlling the city. And what's interesting here is that the U.S. is relatively young, and it's going through these massive urban transformations. And federal and local actions are taken to cure social ills. And so disabilities get saved as a social ill. And so there are laws, keep going, and policies that are passed to help ease what basically was an individual problem by creating social services. So, who took AP History? Who took AP History? Can somebody tell me about the New Deal? Roosevelt's New Deal? Anybody? Somebody?
Yeah, it's just created it's a little vague, but it created like a social welfare.
Social welfare.
Yeah.
So what is social welfare? This side of the room, very quiet. Anybody?
Just,
I think you guys need a break soon. Social welfare basically is a way for the state to redistribute wealth and support people with basic social programs, social services. So education, health care, sanitation, garbage collecting. All these ideas were sort of part of this sort of social, having to get rid of these social ills. And that basically is the birth of the modern welfare state. Next slide. So how is disability embedded within these sort of public programs? Okay. Now we're gonna jump back because asylums really started in the 1850s, but by the time we're in World War II, by the time we're during the New Deal time, you basically have the development of medicine, the development of the professionalization of medicine, but you also have these sort of asylums that are there as public services, and asylums developed at the same time as universities did. So like UC Berkeley, which was a block grant from the state, it was sort of like the state decides to to give this land to the public use so the state builds a university. The same concept they did to build these asylums. So it was seen as a progressive, very modern, cool thing to do, was to build asylums so that people that needed help could get that help. We can go back into asylums in more detail because it's very problematic, but the idea is that states are growing in the way they offer services, and the asylums is one of the services they start to offer. But actually ends up being an American Horror Story, and I'll get back to this more later. But they were pretty nasty after a while because they were part of this notion that a civilized nation needs to provide support and care. And asylums for the deaf, for people that weren't able to speak, for people that were blind, they operated like local or regional state-run charities. And they ended up, they started as that. And then they developed into federal and state institutions. So they became institutionalized. And a lot of those things weren't really managed or run very well, or they fell into decay as sort of society adapted and evolved. So again, there's a notion of charity and the concepts that these charitable approaches then become responsibility of the state. Next slide. So the state starts to really focus on how it can take on responsibility and how it can start redistributing, opportunity and wealth. Next. And really, all of this is about this sort of transformation of how these states evolve and develop. And the person needed to fit within these structures. And social programs needed to be developed to support people to fit in these structures. So as World War II starts to develop, this concept of modernity starts to develop and really shapes, in a lot of ways, every aspect of government, every aspect of culture, of art, of architecture. This building, for example, Worcester Hall, is kind of this brutal modernist building. It's a building that is just about, straight lines. It's about having the bare minimum. There's no embellishments, no fancy little things on the outside. It's just about function. And so people need to fit within what these cities were starting to develop. And they're really developing a huge kind of push, at least in the US, to support the war movement. So it's really this massive push to make things efficient, effective, right? And so people with disabilities that don't conform to a standardized model, standardization is a big issue in modernity, were sort of left out. Next slide. So here you have two images of standardization. And these are two prominent planners. One is Le Corbusier, embodiment of normality, on the left side, which shows kind of a human figure and sort of shows some measurements of how far they can reach. And on the right is Dreyfus's standard man. And these are examples of the dominance of normalization, standardization, and planning, policy, and design. So very much, your average male body type, really was conceived average, probably white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male body type. And that was your typical form that you were building your city to. You're building your car for. You're building your school for. You're building things for this type of person. And anybody that didn't fit into this standardized body would have to adjust to those designs, those measures, those ways of and functionalities of how you would design. And the reason why they did this again was to make things efficient, right? If we have one body, you can build everything to that body type, and the doors are at this width, then you have really easy instructions to give people so that you just build. So this mass production, no customization required, right? But you leave a lot of people out. Next slide. So, as that's developing in design world, there's also the development and professionalization of medicine and rehabilitation. And Howard Rusk lobbies the federal government for major funds for the federal government to really create a professionalization of an arm of medicine called rehabilitation science and rehabilitation medicine, which really was this really of a push linked to World War II with all these veterans that are coming back from the war on how to get them back in the workplace. And that's where you have a lot of innovation in design of wheelchairs, design of prosthetics, design of equipment through rehabilitation science. Howard Rusk. Is it,
World War One or World War Two?
that was, well, World War One, there was a start of rehabilitation science when they came back. But really it became much more like mainstream and very structured in World War II. And the reason why I put it in World War II is because a lot of the people that you saw protesting in the film that we saw during the first week were literally rejecting this model that your doctor was the only one that could decide your life. The doctor was the one to decide what time you got up, what time you went to bed. You know, all aspects of your life were sort of medicalized so that you could be fixed and then brought back into society. Does that make sense? So next slide. So the really disability is strictly a medical problem. The challenge is that rehab's goals are limited. The goals of rehabilitation is to fix the physical or biological limitations so that the individual can fit into a standard, fixed, normalized environment. A modernist framework. The environment is fixed. It cannot be changed. If you want to fit in the environment, change yourself. We're not going to change the building. We're changing you. So a lot of you with disabilities felt, or not felt, were explicitly left out. So the Mary Lou Breslin reading about her being carried was a way that she would fix her way of doing things to be able to fit into that classroom. They wouldn't change the class to the first floor. They wouldn't build an elevator. They would carry a car up the flight of stairs to go to that class. And in a lot of parts of the world, this is still very much operates in this way. But the classes can challenge us to think about how the environment could be changing, how the environment could be a variable that could be more responsive to people's abilities. That's coming up next. So really the medical issue is that there's a power dynamic, there's a dependence, and there's a certain type of asymmetry between your power to choose. You basically don't have any power to choose because you have to fit into a very normalized set of codes or normalized space. Do you guys understand when I say normalized space? Yeah, like standard space. Okay, next. Alright, so doctors decide, we talked about this, patients are objectified, prognosis is essentialized, meaning that your disease, your diagnosis is everything there is to know about you. Right? And that patients internalize this dependent status. You start to believe that you're not good enough unless you fix yourself. And the wheelchair, instead of being seen as a liberation, a tool for your independence, the wheelchair is seen as a failure. A wheelchair is seen as you're not able to walk, so you failed to fit into society. Let me give you this wheelchair so that you can do something, but you still can't do everything everybody else can do. And a lot of people with disabilities reject that notion. Later. But there is no consciousness of that yet during this time, or not as much. Next slide. So the modernist bias is that the built environment reinforces the notion that everybody must be altered to fit the environment. So the environment is fixed. Can the environment be changed? Next. So there is this idea that we want to shake off these shackles. We don't want to be standardized. We don't want to be normal. So a lot of you guys grew up under the Obama presidency. And a lot of you guys live in Berkeley, where diversity is valued, or being different is good. But that is a new notion that directly is a response to the other notion that everybody being the same is good. Does that make sense? So under a normative framework, being able to conform and being able to fit is good. Not fitting is not good. Does that make sense? These guys start to challenge that. They challenge policy planning and design, and they do this confrontational organizing, which in some ways was militant. Disabled people really reject these social norms and start to ride the wave of civil rights. And next slide. And they really form this powerful resistance. Disability illustrates the struggle to define and assert access. City Linton. Define and assert access. And access and choice. Next slide. So you guys saw a lot of this idea, right? You saw this. Disability, a product of the interaction between the individual and their environment. So disability is not just the property of the individual, but now the new norm, or the new ideas, or the new paradigm, which is in this sort of, it's becoming much more of a social conception, is that the environment can be altered. And so this new socio-political notion evolves. And so this is where designers come in. There was very little role for designers in all the other models of disability. Why? Because there was no external concept of disability. There's no need to think about access, because it doesn't matter what was going on outside the individual. Under this notion of disability, this more the social notion of disability, the designers become really, really important. Because now the designers can design ways that people can be included, that people can be productive, that people can realize their hopes, their dreams, that people can actually become citizens, which they actually weren't full citizens, because they couldn't contribute to society. Next slide. So, that's a very quick, very broad overview of the history of disability and environmental design. That's a very, very short way of saying that cities can create spaces that emulate and perpetuate social norms, and those spaces themselves can perpetuate those social norms. So let me give you an example. In some of the work that I do abroad, when I speak with the Minister of Urban Planning, This happened in 2003. I went to Serbia, to Belgrade, and I had an interview with the minister in charge of urban planning. And I said, sir, I noticed that you don't have any laws or any policies to ensure accessibility in the streets. He said, we don't need to make our streets accessible. I said, why not? He said, because there are no disabled people in the city. I said, maybe if you made the streets accessible, you'd be able to go outside and you'd be able to see them because they'd be using the streets. So you understand what I'm saying? The social and the spatial are related. If you can't go outside because the space doesn't allow you to move around outside, then you're invisible as though you don't exist. So you would perpetuate the concept that disabled people are few and far between, and we don't need to cater to them. But this data now suggests that 1 out of every 7 people in the world lives with a kind of a disability. It doesn't have to be as significant as mine. It could be an invisible disability. But that's 1 billion people in the world that live with a disability. So this is why this is important. It's important because we've come to a point in time where the way we have conceptualized and understood disability involves each one of you. You guys are all involved. Everybody has some kind of limitation or constraint. Everybody's dependent on something else. Nobody lives in isolation as a perfect form, and the way we move around and the way we do things changes. Right? So, as we think about diversity and inclusion, and we think about disability, and we think about design, there are several disciplines that are associated with the built environment that now, because of this whole evolution, and because of the laws and the changing social position of disability, affects each one of you here. Next slide. I mentioned that that urban planning started from this concept of sanitary science because these cities were so dirty. So sanitary science was kind of an early profession that started to create laws and regulations to protect public health. But that also evolved next. That developed and evolved into the urban planning profession that wanted to create policies and programs that promote everything from affordable housing to provide emergency services, administer public programs, manage infrastructure, plan transportation improvements, stimulate public discourse. This whole field of urban planning is about shaping and influence the overall nature of neighborhoods, cities, and metropolitan areas, systems, as well as subnational, national, and multinational geographies. Disability plays into all of that because people with disabilities, are using public transportation, are part of their communities, are citizens that the national, subnational, and multinational laws, policies, and programs are increasingly responding to. Next slide. Architecture, design of individual buildings, neighborhoods, or cities. How we take into account, a billion people. It's really about how we, again, build the kind of spaces that reflect the values that we have. Next slide. Landscape architecture, a practice that can range from design of open spaces to open public parks. It's really how you can move around in a space and how you design that space that sort of says who can take advantage of that space, right? Thanks. Urban design works with overall physical appearance of buildings, relationships between buildings, it's about the fabric that weaves together, our cities. How does the aesthetic and the design guidelines target and affect different kinds of people? And this also is interesting because the urban design is everything from even the colors and the materials, all kinds of things. Next slide. Laws, the legislative framework. How a society is supposed to behave through incentives and disincentives. Laws are really linked to the type and uses of attitudes, behaviors, and it's about how, for the built environment, how to construct things, how to comply with certain regulatory standards. So laws can define what accessibility is and what the lack of accessibility is. Laws can impose penalties on people that conform or comply or don't comply with those laws. Right, next slide. Sociology. Sociologists and anthropologists study the rich texture of human interactions and how individuals see themselves in relationship to others. So how do people with disabilities see themselves in relationship to others? How do people without disabilities see people with disabilities? And also, how are these behaviors and attitudes, how do they play out? Next slide. Economics. And multiple subfields. Specifically relevant to the built environment is a lot of how cities grow and how the economic transactions within that city, impact the people that live there. If people with disabilities have an infrastructure that removes barriers to transportation, removes physical barriers, they can have jobs, they can keep jobs, they can contribute to the city. And a lot of the early studies in the 90s, before the ADA was really being implemented, the biggest complaint was that physical access was a huge barrier to being able to hold a job and to be able to get to a job or even be able to get to school, right? So we pushed, in your lifetime, the United States made huge advances to improve physical access, right? So that people could get jobs and enter the workplace. But there still are there's a huge disconnect in terms of how many people with and without disabilities are actually being employed. It's almost twice as much. It's still twice as much. So it's interesting to explore later why hasn't the percentage changed that much? The employment figures changed that much, even though the built environment has changed considerably, right? So again, there are multiple professions that have an impact on urban planning and urban design in the built environment and have an impact on disability. Next slide. Medicine. This is pretty self-evident. Doctors define and diagnose what your physical condition is. But there's also interesting, a friend of mine who is a Paralympic athlete got her residency in rehabilitation science. She did medical school at Harvard, and she's a chair user. And so now persons with disabilities becoming doctors is also kind of a new sort of area. We talked about public health next. So I think overall, keep going. There's a lot of different professions, keep going, where you can see that disability becomes another dimension by which you can contribute to that conversation. And here, in this school, in this building, you're engaged in sort of a new journey, a journey of discovery that has been invisible, that people haven't seen, that people haven't explored, that to a great degree is still at the very beginning, which is how do you create a world where everybody whether or not they have a disability, can have an equal shot at getting to school, getting to work, pursuing their hobbies, developing their potential, and then contributing those skills, and contributing those visions, and contributing those talents to enriching society as a whole. So with that, there are two guests that I'm going to ask to join us on stage so that we can have a conversation about what we just discussed. Let's give them a round of applause. So, Gordon Fuller and Bart Owen. We'll have a little panel discussion on this very heavy lecture, and I'm going to give you guys a chance to grill them, to thrill them, to do whatever you want to them, so that you can get a sense of both their individual journeys, some of the collective experience that we talked about, and some of the ways that design and the built environment and this kind of evolving concepts of disability have shaped their own lives. So with that, I want to welcome you guys. Thank you so much for coming. These guys, you guys are both also filmmakers, and you're working on ways of exploring disability culture more generally, understanding how to tell a story so that people kind of evolve their way of thinking. Let me start off with you, Owen. What do you think has been the biggest sort of factor in shaping your life, specifically when it comes to some of the topics we discussed in this lecture, in terms of changing notions of disability, in terms of the changes in the built environment?
Yeah, wow, that's quite the question.
Yes. And you can introduce yourself too.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so like you said, my name's Owen. I'm I go to school here. I'm a senior. I'll be graduating in the fall. I actually took this semester off to work on a feature film. I'll be gone for a few months, and so that's what I'm working on right now. But growing up with a disability, I think kind of like what we've been learning from this lecture is that really what that means is that the world wasn't designed with you in mind, and that's definitely an obstacle. It doesn't mean that there's anything, really preventing you from doing something if you put your mind to it, but it is something that really shaped the way I think of things, and I think that I view a lot of things as like just, there's another added step, if that makes sense. So I guess that is really what shaped what I do, and I think what I'm trying to do with my media and my filmmaking, along with a few other projects I'm working on, is engaging people kind of like we talked about, there's three types of disability models, and I think that we're moving in to the fourth, which is what could be called societal, where there's not so much, there's not so many physical barriers anymore, in the disability movement. I think that there's, we have more access than we ever have before. It's still not perfect by a long shot, but where we need to really engage people, from my perspective, is socially and societally, and kind of get people to view people as disabilities as people with disabilities, not disabled people. So that's the focus of my work, and I hope to accomplish that through media. And yeah, excited to be here.
Do you want to respond to that, Gordon?
Gordon, could you, scoot yourself to the left a little?
I humbly bow to the camera. Yeah, I have to, first I'd like to just applaud Victor for what a wonderful summation of the entire experience and the history of disability. He covers it all in his talk here today, and it's a wonderful overview for all of you. Very honored to be here amongst all of you. I'm particularly delighted to catch you at this point in your careers, before you make bad buildings, no, or policy. Yeah, and I'm 63 years old. I started life as a child prodigy artist. I went to the university when I was a little kid. I studied art design in Europe. And then about 11, my family learned that the polio vaccine we'd received in 1959 had a simian virus in it, and that it would progressively lead to a loss of eyesight. Now, one of the interesting things about disability, different than other minority people in society, is that with people with disabilities, we start out that even our own families discriminate against us. And that may not be in a wicked or way, but it may be just overly protective and trying to keep us from the slings and arrows of life and so on. And so that's kind of the challenge of it all. I think as a designer, I found myself at 10 years old waiting under my desk for nuclear annihilation. And it kind of clued me in that society around me had a kind of monkey nuts thing going. We weren't really very rational or intelligent. Apparently, as I grew up as an adult, I'd get to this point where one day I'd start hating people or something. I'd be insane, and I wondered, is it when you're 13, 15, 18, 21, when you can start to drink? How is it you come to hate people and want to destroy the world? So it bothered me quite a lot, and I had sort of forgotten about it eventually as I grew up. But at 28, I had to quit driving a car, and suddenly I felt so ill-defined as a human being, because this car, which had defined me, was sort of a male extension of myself, if you know what I mean, was no longer in the picture, and I would just have to be me. And then I realized I'd gone nuts.
Why did you have to abandon the use of the car?
My vision had deteriorated to the point where no longer could I drive a car safely and wisely, and it was the beginning of a real education for me, because I think if we take a poll and a survey of any room and say, who here is disabled? Well, what kind of group is that to join? Disabled. How about uncapables?
Undesirables.
But what we're really talking about is the natural life cycle of human beings, from childhood to age old. There is a point in life where sometimes you have lessened abilities or impairments or incapacities of some kind. And so that's just a natural part of human life. So how is it in our design process, as we embrace policies and architectures and design our world, how are we doing with that? Well, in the United States, we have led the world with policies aimed at removing barriers for people with disabilities. The idea was to create a fully inclusive society. A bold step. Never before in the world has anyone done that. The people of the United States really did support that idea, given that it's 1 in 5 of us often here in the United States, with an aging population that looks like a hockey stick, to use a business term. It just is absolutely the case that this is our future and something we need to do. But check it out. We've spent probably trillions of dollars retrofitting the world to make the barriers go away, to improve accessibility. And yet, and here's how I can prove a cultural bias, have you ever heard anyone advertise that fact? Like, come to Miami, Florida, where accessibility is a feature built in. Nobody. Hawaii, I live in Hawaii. We go after people in Taiwan. Can we get people in the community together to help us strategize how we're going to bring in more Taiwanese tourists? That's very nice, but how about 1 in 6 people traveling? We are the future. We're a huge number of people. Every major country in the world has a huge aging population. And then let's not forget the children. So all of us need better design. And I can tell you as a designer, everything I touch reflects nothing but greed. Someone has taken a shortcut, someone's made the lowest common denominator, someone has gotten a monopoly on light switches or whatever it is. And it's really hard to see good design evolve. It's been a long time coming. But we live now in this age of miracles, from gene therapies, which actually promise to reverse the damage of my eyes this year, to enhancements of human beings, to AIs, to new kinds of wayfinding navigational systems, the sort of thing I work in. And all of that promises to change our relationship to the environment around us. And so I'm kind of focused on the fact that it's a human right. We have a human right to information about the built environment. It's the one thing missing. As we've made accessibility a requirement and have put it into law and requirements are enforced, no one's thought about, but where is it? So as you approach this building, if you're a chair user, you have to wonder, where's the ramp, where's the elevator, how do I navigate, where's the parking? No help for you there. And yet, as again, 1 in 6 of us moving about, traveling, how's that going to work, as we move around in the world around us? And the truth is, with the kinds of technologies that we now have, it's a better interface is all we need. A better, more humane face to the world around us. One that is encompassing our desires and our needs. And that's the kind of work I'm doing these days with design. We believe it should be built in from the ground up. You start with an accessible design. You don't just paste it on top. That's an interesting idea, iPhone. It is accessible. But OMG, do sighted people put up with some serious BS? This is not a good design when I'm only 15 clicks away from whatever I'm trying to do, And I have to study it and understand it and figure out all its quirks, I'm working too hard. This thing, if it's a relationship, it's a bad relationship. I'm doing all the work, it knows nothing about me. And so that's all about to change. And you guys will be the tip of the spear in this area, because these will be the opportunities. Everybody else is already oinked in with their monopolies. Here you come with a whole new way of looking at the world, a new set of tools, for me, a new palette of colors. Technology can give us a lot of opportunities, and telling stories is how us 3 gentlemen come together. We know how it is to be on the outside of society. If you think about it, television, film, media, never do you see people with disabilities, very rarely, today more so than ever. But other than Hansel and Gretel and the hideous old witch, or the the superheroes that have been twisted by their disability to become evil, it's an age-old story of disability. So we're trying to reverse those trends, and we believe telling our own stories and sharing those with others gives us the power. And those of us who make films, we know that our camera's lens can correct people's vision and help them restore their understanding of our humanity.
So there's a basically a story here, and a thread between both of you guys, which is about understanding a social position that provides unique insights, right? So the fact that there is a understanding that there are these barriers, that there are these challenges, provides a different way of looking at the world. And both of you can mention that. Can you give us some very concrete examples in which your life or your experience looking at the world has been an advantage, competitive advantage, instead of it being sort of a liability? Gordon, you first.
Well, as a user interface, user interaction designer, which is not a role that I'm cast in, but I as the head of these companies that I work with, I tend to apply. It's such an edge, because most people don't know there's a problem. They think it's perfectly okay to have a building directory in the mall over on the side, with a white backlight with these little and a map. The truth is, if you know people, most people don't read maps very well. People aren't really slick at that. Green A, where is that? It's very hard to sort it out. So I'm aware that, gosh, when I walk in the door of the mall, wouldn't it be great if I've already prefetched the path that I want to follow easily and seamlessly? Not so that a big company can spy on me and get in my pocket as I walk about, the very big idea of Apple and Google and IBM and 100 other companies. In the smart cities of the future, they'd like to be your provider. And hey, by the way, when you're on the way to the Sunglass Hut, would you like a slice of pizza? You know, hey, how about a movie discount ticket? I can't live with that sort of thing. So I want to be anonymous. And I don't want to tell them perhaps that I have cancer or I don't have limited mobility or energy. I don't necessarily want the cloud to be all in my business. And so I really want to be anonymous, and I want to be able to move about smoothly without people fearing for me and wanting to run to my aid. You know, I just want to be able to move around. So given that awareness and the fact that I love people I know that are 88 years old, they hate answering machines. They don't know how to run them. You know, I tell them, I embrace your ignorance. I love it. You're the people that I want to serve, because after all, shouldn't the technology be our plastic pal that's fun to be with, as opposed to some sort of thing I have to study a paperback manual or something to, you know, to get on top of? And so I see that most of the 20-year-old testosterone-filled designers are making things that are just really clever. Wow, all you need on this messaging service from Apple is another 3 items on the list. Yeah, you know, and let's push that part where you actually used to type in down below, and let's make people tab down. You know, no one would do this. You know, I wish Steve was back. You know, so you know, really, honestly, having that kind of sensitivity or awareness that there are people that speak Portuguese, you know, or Chinese, Cantonese, you know, and it's mostly Mandarin, that need the right kind of characters to cue them into the environment. Just being aware of human beings working their side of the desk, as opposed to the industrial model of one size fits all, and people will adapt. That's it. That's the whole.
So the insight, really, from your perspective, is to look at the world differently in a way that's a broader perspective, broader users, broader perspective. How about you, Owen? How have you sort of seen a competitive advantage?
Yeah, so for me as a filmmaker, I find my competitive edge in the fact that there aren't many disability stories in the media. You know, in the world we live in, there's a big social justice push. And one of the communities that is, you know, has been and historically left out is the disabled community. But like Gordon was saying, like, we are the future, you know, like, there is so much potential for the disabled community, and like, you know, we said earlier, 1 in 6 people in the world have some sort of disability. You know, disabilities are all around us, and it's really, you know, I was at a venture capitalist meeting today, pitching our movie idea to them, and, you know, we say, like, hey, you know, this is a story about a person with a disability, not about the person's disability. They say, wow, you know, we've never heard this story before. This is a unique story. So from, you know, the film world, Hollywood wants to see a story that hasn't been done before. And, you know, how many stories are there that haven't been done before? I don't know if any of you have written a story, but it's hard to think of something that you didn't see already, and that's just because there's so many stories that have been done. But there's still a lot of disabled stories. So I think that's really something I've been thinking about lately is, you know, it is an advantage to, you know, be from a smaller community and, you know, be an ally with a smaller community, because there's so many unsolved problems.
Excellent. Let's open up to the class. You know, I think we covered a lot of ground today, both in terms of the evolving notion of disability, understanding disability, and the way that it's sort of embedded socially, how it's impacted the lives of these two talented individuals. Is there something that sort of jumps out at you guys? Any questions that you want to engage with our guests? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to say that I completely agree with you about technology really advancing and how we can really use that to our advantage. And it's just really just as designers to really think a lot and be a lot more broad-minded and take in various different perspectives that, because you know when you try to design something, and especially what Gordon was talking about too, you want to do something that's tells a story that's not told before, or when we want to design a building or design space or anything, it's something that all of us try to seek, and we can find this opportunity from taking various perspectives that are not normally considered in social media going on. And that's sort of where I come to this. What I believe in is that the more challenges we take on as designers, the more opportunities we're creating for us to really create our designs, to be able to really, it's not like being reductive. It's not like when we take on challenges and stuff, it's not, it's more of a way we can be more innovative and just really expand our horizon. You know, and that's, I agree with you completely, Gordon. It's really good to hear.
So when I get to be 80, I want all of you to be my designers, please. You know, I can assure you, your forefathers never thought about any of this, and only grudgingly. 2014, in March, they required every commercial swimming pool in the United States to have a chairlift, and it was installed into jacuzzis and pools. And you know for a fact that most of the hotel industry was very dead set against it. And they said, you know, we don't ever have people with disabilities in our pool. I heard that in Hawaii with the Democratic Party. I'm their accessibility coordinator on their executive committee, a role I created for myself. Anyway, and they said, well, if they tell us they're coming, then we'll do the transcribing. And I go, well, would you feel very welcome if you called them up and say, hey, I've got a Democrat coming? You know, you know, it's not how it is. Inclusive means inclusive. You make provision for people, and then they know it's there, and then they'll use it, you know, and that's just it. It is an edge to have an insight. And I'd say this, you know, you don't want people with disabilities behind you or people challenged by impairments. You want them in front of you, working with you together, you know, trying to find a good balance. When I first found out I was going to go blind, the little talk I had with myself ended with, well, you know, if you're open to it, there may be some wisdom that you gain from working with this. You might learn something if you're open to it. And I have. It's been a humbling experience for me, to be sure, which is really good for me, actually. I needed that. But it's been one where my compassion and empathy has been open to new ways of understanding the world and seeing the world. And that's all that any artist ever or designer ever hopes for, is having a different way to look at the world.
Yes.
So, with events and venues, there seems to be almost kind of a fad approach in terms of asking if anyone has any access or accommodations that they need. And I just want to know if there's anything that we can do to prevent it from being a fad and kind of move that in a sustainable way so it can be implemented more permanently.
I can say something to that. I really appreciate it when people ask me if there's something I need. You know, I find that like very welcoming. Like Gordon was saying, I think that like there does need to be a baseline that's like, you know, you don't have to have it for everything. But with that said, I find it very inclusive if, you know, an organizer, even a fellow conference attendee, student, you know, film patron, what have you, comes up and is like, hey, you know, is there anything you need? You know, I personally find that very welcoming. I know what you think, Gordon.
Oh, definitely. And you know, as opposed to me showing up ready for a fight, which is kind of the usual thing, you know. It's like, what do you mean you don't have narrative captioning? You know, how is that possible? On the airplane, you know, hey, I'm flying first class. Where's the narrative description? You know, hey, I'm going to watch a movie. How's that going to work? So it was like that for me always. And one thing I can say, too, about that is, you know, for those of you who didn't come today with your own chair, how would you feel if you came to this room and there were no chairs? You know, you'd say, we have an expectation that there are chairs available for us.
Accommodation.
You're accommodated, and that's the same for me. My accommodation for this environment would be, give me the blueprints and the designs and the 3D models of this building and put labels on them, please. Tell me where the accessibility resources are, and then don't monitor me when I use it, please. And that would work for me as a basic human right. You know the information is somewhere. It's usually in an office someplace, in a blueprint drawer or something, or at the county or the state level, filed away someplace. So if that information is available, why isn't it a right that I get it? Because I'm a guy who would have a hell of a time finding the restroom without it. So that's how I think about it.
Gordon, you bring up a very good point, which I was hoping we would get to later this semester, which is that people's grandparents, or just a few generations ago, could not have conceptualized or conceived the disruption that information communication technologies would have on everybody. And sort of the unique way that information communication technology really opened up choice and opened up new capabilities for people with disabilities. So perhaps you or Owen could just briefly speak a little bit to, this class is about the built environment. So we are thinking about the physical form, but you sort of seem to go back to quite a lot to information. Could you maybe expand a little bit about how we should be thinking about, design from both of those perspectives? From the aspect of access to information, access to digital technologies, because we'll be speaking about that much later in the course, and how is that related to the built environment? Do they have anything to do with each other? Are they two completely different concepts?
Well, I'll just jump in because blind people are the tough guys for the age of information. And if you think about it, the age of information, what does that mean? Well, the information is all about. All you have to do is find it and link to it. That's very nice. But what I would prefer is the age of awareness. When I walk up on this building, wouldn't it be great if the blueprints got loaded into my portable AI mobile device? And with that, I'd be cued as to my destination. It would tap on my wrist or whisper into my glasses, or, this is something I desperately need, because honestly, for now 25 years, I pioneered some virtual reality technologies, and I was at the forefront of that field as a research and development matter. And I always thought ahead, I'm going to be totally blind someday. How am I going to find the restroom, the exit, the fire exit? And how does that work? And the answer is, no one's thought of that, and no one's provisioned for it. And yet, now we're in this time where Google and everybody's talking about indoor navigation. Remember the pizza slice flying at you. And, it's really quite predatory. And Salesforce has built a gajillion-dollar company mining everyone's personal information. So you walk in that mall, they're going to guess what you're doing there, and they're going to try to help you with that. Now, that model is highly exploitive, and when it comes right down to it, it's not a customer relationship, is it? A relationship is where you and I have discussions, and we share perspectives, and we communicate. What they're doing is more like a stalker, and that's interesting. I get it, but wow, why don't you enter in a relationship with me, and I'll share anonymously what my intentions are, which is far more valuable in the end. If I show up at Costco and buy no vegetables and leave, if I volunteered that, I was there to look for organic vegetables, Costco might say, wow, that's 40% of the people coming here. I think we ought to get some organic vegetables. Much more useful to them than saying, what's he doing? Which aisle did he go to? What do you really get out of that? Yeah. So they haven't embraced us. And now when people are talking about smart cities, Victor, do we ever hear them ever mention accessibility as being how we can empower the people who, a lot of ways, society has forgotten? And even on that note, by the way, the pity model, which is used very extensively in our disability community to raise funds, which is very effective, help us poor folks. is a disservice when it comes collectively to the point where everybody's got this perception that people with disabilities are poor, they don't have money. I've heard it so many times from venture capital people when we tell them we're working on consumer products or a film for people with disabilities. Oh, those people have no money. Really? Because in England, the Barclays Bank did a advertising agency did a research on it, and they assumed also we would be like the lower income people. But wait a minute, it turns out that it's 53% of the market. How is that possible? Well, it's not just us 57 million Americans, for example. It's our family and friends, because they're all in on it too. They're not going to buy a van that grandma can't ride in with her walker or can't use the washing machine. Major appliances, everything. And I think Victor just shared with me one of the statistics that is people with disabilities in the course of their lifetime spend far more than anyone else, because of course, we have medical treatments and things that sometimes, and we have to have aides or attendants. When we travel, we have someone with us. So here's my biggest question to all of you. Why are we not a very big, fat, lucrative market? And if you're a market, and that's my humble goal in the work I do in the films I make, if I'm a market, then you will cater to me. You will treat me nice and with respect. You'll know I'm there. You'll want to help me. You won't be just shoving me aside as those people, at the back of the bus.
So the market basically allows us to solve problems. The market will say, wow, there's a way that we could gear our investments to solve those problems. But the market wouldn't have existed without certain laws or certain social norms or certain ways of evolving our way of thinking. And so when you ask us to sort of consider what are the types of interventions that can be made, you're really looking at from where we are today to where we could be tomorrow, right? And you're looking at it in a very positive way. What threats do you guys see, either in politics or in anything in society, where we might go backward, or we might lose sort of our position in society? Kind of the rebirth of eugenics, for example.
That's actually what my film is about. It's about a cult of eugenics that are attacking the disabled community.
Can you explain what eugenics is and maybe tied
Yeah.
to World War II?
Okay, yeah. So, if you don't know, eugenics is the idea of like societal hygiene. So that, there's certain groups of people that are undesirable. A good example of what can happen when eugenics is implemented is the Holocaust. The Nazis thought that, Jews and, gay people and people with disabilities were a drain on society, and so they just killed them all, which is a pretty fucked up idea.
They were the first to go.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, people with disabilities were some of the first ones in the camps.
Mm-hmm.
That's that's kind of a theme. The film I'm making, it's called Angels of Mercy. It's about, a group of nurses that are like granting their patients mercy through killing them, even though they don't want to die. So it's a psychological thriller. Yeah. And, but it's up to, like I said, a person with a disability actually, fights them and comes out. Well, you have to see the movie to know how.
Don't let Donald Trump see it, that's all.
Yeah, I think in terms of, threats, I see that, I think the big one is obviously, funding. There's a lot of social welfare programs that, I use to pay my nurses, my caregivers, my wheelchair. It's like a $30,000 machine that I was able to get for free from the government. Really amazing programs we have in the U.S. specifically. So one of my biggest concerns is really funding. But I do think that, the disability community is resilient by nature. So I think that if someone tried to call some shit, there would be quite a backlash.
They're going to be dealing with us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the, it's not hard to imagine, especially after this election. Donald Trump has a nephew that has cerebral palsy. Anybody ever heard that before? No. Did he ever play to the people with disabilities by saying, I'm very sympathetic, I have a nephew? You know, the man is a little bit weird there, and we're very terrified at this time what it might mean for the country. But then again, I believe in the people of the United States as being a dynamic, resilient force, and people taking away the things that we've come to rely upon for the health and well-being of our family members will be a real shitstorm that will be unleashed. So, you know, I'm kind of conveniently aware that people in our community, all of us, are working hard to make sure that that message gets through. But when you think about it, in this last election, 57 million people, their families and friends, no one talking to us. There wasn't anybody out there making it clear. I mean, they made it seem like they were friendly to us. Well, at least one side did. But that's about it. And wow, you know, our influence isn't counted, and we're not seen really as a community. And that's kind of the truth. There isn't a community. There's a community of chair users, there's blind people, deaf people, people with developmental disabilities, Asperger's, you know, the list goes on. And each of them kind of vies for the same resources, more or less, or a share of them, and it becomes kind of contentious, and it's not very helpful. And some of the gatekeepers, the people that have advanced in those fields, don't often, you know, support a lot of new stuff coming, and so it's really hard to make it work. You know, sometimes I think our motto was "No good deed goes unpunished." After 50 years of being a disability advocate, but having said all of that, the real truth is we are a people who are family members. We are related to people. We have loved ones and friends, and for those who are wise and open to the understanding that people with disabilities are problem solvers, and our family members are as well, there'll be huge opportunities for new products to be developed in the new age of personalization, customization. There'll be machines that'll see patterns and recognize how they can be better served, perhaps for good, we hope. But I also am concerned that there have been these, like the eugenics movement, the right to die movement, which has kind of talked about how people who in their dying days might need some mercy, you know. It's currently that way. And make no mistake about it, when you have very bad cancer, they just take you out on the morphine highway, and it's okay. But in putting through legislation like this, guess who's behind the legislation? Insurance companies, because it costs a lot of money to keep people alive when they have a profound disability, a lot of money. And the fact is, like I said, most people's families, I have a friend, Kelly Buckland, who's head of the National Council for Independent Living in Washington. He's one of our leading policy advocates in Washington. When he was in an automobile accident up in Idaho, sitting there in his bed in recovery, his doctor said, "I don't blame you for wanting to die. If I were you, I'd want to die also." That's the doctor. His father said, "Son, it'd have been better if you'd died." You know, well, of course, you know, that's what people feel, you know. But fortunately, nobody allows them to do that immediately. You know, it took me a couple years to warm up to the idea of hanging around with the challenge I was facing. And my own precious brother preferred actually to die than to live.
And your brother had the same condition, the same virus.
Yeah, he did. And you know, he didn't want to live. He was a very accomplished astrophysicist. He invented video over the internet, of all things, and was a great guy. But the social stigma of disability was too much for him, which it's inspired a lot of my work, honestly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for your leadership. I think each person that moves the ball forward is able to open that up for so many others.
Sorry, I just had a question. Something that was mentioned earlier was smart cities, and you just reminded me by mentioning driving automobiles. So with the introduction of self-driving cars, how do you think that's going to help break the barriers between those who are disabled and not disabled in our community, if at all?
What do you guys think of self-driving cars?
Yeah, well, I'm super excited for self-driving cars. Yeah, I mean, that's like a real big barrier to independence, because every time I have to go somewhere, I'm fortunate enough to have the resources to buy a car, so I have a car. But anywhere I go, I need someone to drive. So that does limit, what I can do and like the logistics involved. Uber and Lyft are not accessible. So that's something that isn't available to people in my condition with wheelchairs. So self-driving cars are going to be pretty sweet.
For me, a lot of my blind friends were immediately thrilled about self-driving cars. But I'm kind of an internationalist. I think, how is it owning a $70,000 car is good for people with disabilities generally? And, if you think about it, what we really need is better transportation systems. And I'm hearing some of that. Ford was saying they're aiming now at an age when we go past the personal ownership of vehicles. That makes sense. There might be little things that transport you up to the grocery store, and there might be something bigger that takes you and hooks up to a train. We could envision lots of things. I like the Minority Report. It was my favorite vision. The thing drives up the side of the building and pulls in his living room. That's pretty cool. You can watch TV in it too, maybe. Yeah. So to me, it's an interesting concept, transportation. And transportation on demand is kind of the way. It could be well, but my concern is always that we're a very wealthy, at least we have been, nation, perhaps not in the future. But, as such, why do we always have to be the ones finding extractive solutions that are going to rip from the earth the precious minerals and the resources and deny other people in the rest of the world simple basics? And I think we could do better. I heard somewhere that people in the United States were 1/3 less healthy than people in the UK, England. And why is that? The food better there? Healthcare, about the same. What is it then? Well, they walk a lot. They don't just strap a car in their ass to go wherever they're going. They are people that walk to the store and walk to the pub and walk to their home and walk to the train. And that's a really much healthier way to be. So, with respect to my friends that are mobility challenged, too, I absolutely embrace the thought of how that could be upped about 1,000% in the future. It is also a concern that we follow stupid models, and really that's the bottom line. There's something a little wrong with our minds. They were developed for being in perfect balance with this gorgeous earth that we live on, but we now live in a synthetic world of our own making, and the way our pain and avoiding and pleasure-seeking brains work, it limits our perspective and gives us bad impulses if they're badly aligned. And that's why we're in our present crisis as a species with the destruction of our ecosystem. So honestly, transportation is one of those things that I red flag as being something we need to be a little more careful about than just to assume all of us wealthy folks are going to go get cars. I have 3 myself, or 4, I think. I'm not sure about one of them. And as it is, I don't drive, and it's just out of necessity. And I think of it as an enormous expense on every person. If you had a king come along and say, I'm taking a third of your income for your transportation and a half your money for your housing, no one would stand for it. So how is it we put up with it? It's just kind of that way. We're slowly being boiled, And so I question everything, because I'm still under my desk at 10 years old waiting to be vaporized, I don't trust you people.
As you can see, these guys have a whole range of ideas, opinions, and vision for the world, for their place in it, and also for the ways they want to contribute to shaping the world. Let me ask you guys if you would like to share something with the class or some kind of call to action before we move on to the last part of the class.
Definitely. So this film I'm working on is called Angels of Mercy, and we're going to be going out to New York to film in March and April. So if you guys would like to, check out some more, I can send out the link to our Facebook and website. And it'd be really great if you could look at that.
So they can look at Angels of Mercy on
Yeah.
Facebook.
Yeah, maybe I could send you the link and then
Yeah.
you could send it out.
So
Courses. for you
it'll
guys.
be on B courses.
Cool.
Angels of Mercy. And is it true that you have an Indiegogo campaign too?
Yes, we do have an Indiegogo campaign that has about a week left in it. Yeah, that'd be great if you could share that to your networks. We're doing a thunderclap. Do you all know what thunderclap is? Someone heard of that? So it's a newfangled social networking tool. We get a bunch of people to sign up for it, and then it posts. Everyone that signed up for it, it posts on their page at the same time, so it bumps up the posts in the algorithm. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Cool. Never know. So yeah, if you could sign up for that too, that would be super cool. We need like 15 more people, otherwise it won't go at all. So there's like 3 days left on that. So that would be super helpful, and yeah, just very excited to it.
So Thunderclap, the Indiegogo campaign, and the Facebook for your movie.
Yeah.
Great. Gordon?
I was going to say, we could do this, people. 15. Let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, oh, goodness. Call to action. Be good designers. You know, think out of the box. Out of the box. I mean, literally, don't think in the box. Boxes are, you know, for old age, you know, thoughts. We're in a whole new age of things. Buildings should be dynamic. They should be more geared to our humanity and to the environment in which we live. The information about a place is essential as a human right, and I'd really like to see more understanding of just what a future city might offer to people challenged by impairments or age or illness. I think it's one of the areas where we could shine most brightly. And indeed, our country has led the world in many of these areas, mostly because we've had that. I think that's the greatest gift of the United States, is that we've been a social experiment. We've been willing to take on things and look at things a little differently for various reasons, not all of them good. But, you know, in terms of the social evolution of humanity, we have had some good positive roles, and I hope that we'll still be able to do that. And I think the age that I'm looking for is about to occur. Sooner or later, somebody's going to recognize, hey, what about those 57 million people? You know, sooner or later, somebody at Salesforce is going to go, damn, yeah, and they'll find a new channel that they can explode. But the only thing is, who are we? Do they know us? Do they know our stories? Have they ever thought of things from our side of the desk? Do they understand what an 88-year-old woman with 3 PhDs and 28 books needs in her life? You don't know. People aren't spending enough time in the right place. They're trying to always fit a standard model. So the old world is still with us. I can't wait for it to go away. And I think doing more with less is a challenge for all humanity, and for coming up with new and better ways to enhance our humanity. That's my call to action for you, and I'd love to follow along, and we'll share links with Victor and the class.
Great. Well, as you can see, this is a really fantastic way. I'm going to ask Allison to come up, but before that, I want you guys to give these guys a huge welcome and round of applause.